Raise your hand if you've heard of geoengineering. Okay. Most hands just went up. Raise your hand if you think you know a lot about geoengineering. Okay. David should be raising his hand, and we've got one raised hand over there. So yes, rather suddenly, it seems like the debate around climate systems engineering and geoengineering and all of the different buckets of technology that includes seems like they've suddenly entered our mainstream debate. And yet we don't know a lot about it. Almost nobody raises their hands, and yet we need to know about these technologies, which is why it's one key focus of the new institute. And so we have such an incredible panel with us today, representing incredibly important views from different perspectives on these topics. First, I want to go to you, David. Can you give us just the lay of the land on how you define the different terms and technologies that fall under the bucket of climate systems engineering and geoengineering writ large?
Sure. So solar geoengineering is the idea that humans could deliberately alter the Earth's energy balance. The Earth is warming up now because the addition of greenhouse gases makes it harder for it to radiate heat back to space. And so it changes the balance between the amount of sunlight the Earth absorbs and the way it can radiate heat back to space. That's what's warming it up. And the idea is that there's ways to deliberately alter that could reduce some of the climate change that comes from accumulated greenhouse gases. So this ranges from really science fiction ideas of building a shield in between the Earth and the sun, which I think is pretty irrelevant for the next many decades, to putting aerosols, which is just a fancy word for a tiny particle that just falls slowly because it's small, into the upper atmosphere, or making some kind of clouds a little bit whiter. These are all things that could change the amount of sunlight the Earth absorbs. Maybe think about changing it by 1% or so. And of those things, I'd say there's only one that we're really confident could be done by deploying existing technologies. That's putting aerosols in the stratosphere. So in some kind of brutal sense, it's clear that you could quite cheaply stop the world warming by doing that. But there are huge uncertainties about exactly how well it would work, what the risks are, and how it could be governed. So that's solar geoengineering. And then carbon removal, I think, is somewhat self-explanatory. The climate problem is, in a deep way, caused by humans taking carbon from deep underground, where it's been isolated from the environment for tens of millions of years or longer, and putting it into the active biosphere. And the only way in the long run to reduce the climate risks is to reverse that process. Solar geoengineering cannot reduce risks in the very long run. Cutting emissions cannot reduce risks in the long run. It can stop making them worse. If you actually want to reduce the climate risks, you would need to reverse the process and take the carbon back into the geosphere.
Thanks for that, David. A crash course in these important topics. I want to turn to you next. Kate mentioned your position on the Climate Overshoot Commission. Can you tell us how your involvement in that commission has helped inform your thinking on these topics, and how it helps you inform your thinking about how Pakistan should be thinking about these issues?
Okay, I don't think I can speak on behalf of Pakistan at the moment as an ex-foreign minister, but I think more in my capacity as the member of the Climate Overshoot. I have to admit, when I first came in and became a member of the Climate Overshoot Commission, literally on the first day, SRM was out there. We were warned that we were, the brown people were invited over there to normalize the introduction of SRM and to get authorization and those types of things. I headed there nevertheless. And my first reaction to that was, honestly, let's not even go there. And as someone who looks at foreign policy, I said, this is like the wars. Okay, we've just gone through the Afghan war, and I said, sometimes the things we want to fix create problems which are bigger than the ones that we intended to fix. Just like the Afghan war, we went and wanted to get rid of extremism, the Taliban, and terrorism, and we ended the war with more extremism, more Taliban, and more terrorism, right? So pretty much that side of the thinking. But I think what really happened was, and I think that's why I am here today, the experience of going through and listening to real, scientific, knowledge-based, rational thinking and reasons, and finding out that And as a country which has been on the receiving end of climate wrath, 2 floods in 12 years, one of them costing us 33 million people affected, etc., one understands that the cost of of temperatures going above 1.5 degrees centigrade, UNEP tells us that it is going to 1.2, and the trajectory that we're following, it is already at 1.2, between 1.2 and 1.3, and the trajectory we're following, end of the century, we're looking at 2.6. So there's a cost attached to that. We are experiencing the effects of the warming of the globe. So when you have that bad, reality, and if you reach a level where that reality will become worse and worse, and the repercussions of global warming will be so out there, then will we have to, not as the first option or the second option, but as the last resort, perhaps go to options where there's not a lot of clarity as to what are the ramifications. So therefore, the Climate Commission, looking at all of these views, we decided that yes, not something that can append cutting emissions or something that can append adaptation. We need all of the above, but there should be a complete moratorium as we speak on large-scale deployment. But do we not need the research? So it's almost like if somebody tells you you need antibiotic to cure yourself, and you just stop having, you do not have antibiotic. In 2015, we told ourselves we need antibiotic, cut emissions. We didn't do it. And now they say there's a brand new drug, it can save your life. Do you not want to know what are the repercussions and ramifications of taking that brand new drug? So this is really the type of thinking that sort of took us to, yes, do the research, find out what could be the ramifications and repercussions, and also let's talk about governance structures that could eventually work around it.
So it sounds like you changed your mind from not even supporting research into it to actually now supporting research.
Absolutely, supporting research, yes.
And we'll come back to that. Nat, I want to turn to you, and a lot of people, including some environmental groups, are deeply concerned about even researching, let alone deploying these types of geoengineering technologies. And we'll get to that. But I want to build on something that Hina said about the climate impacts that we're experiencing now. Why are we even at a point where we're considering even researching geoengineering? And what is the state of play of emissions such that we're considering these types of steps?
Sure. Thanks, Amy. Well, and thanks as well to the University of Chicago and the Institute. I think this is a really terrific development and a great move by the university. And this will really, we've heard all day how much this will contribute to our knowledge. So to your point, it's very simple. We're just putting too much pollution into the air, and that's trapping the heat. As David said, you can turn it around. We're just not cutting emissions fast enough. I'll say a little bit about what I mean. I do want to note, because I'm always, I want to avoid the gloom and doom. I was really interested in what Michael said earlier about, I was glad that Michael didn't adopt the sort of simple academic, pooing of the Paris Agreement. I was also at Paris in 2015, and we have made a lot of progress. If you look at where we were on the eve of the Paris Agreement in 2015, we were headed towards, there's always a distribution around these estimates, so never take a point estimate about temperature, but we were headed towards, let's say, a median estimate of 3.6, 3.7 degrees, with some risk around that, and a tail risk of being well above 4. And I think we just heard Hina said, if you look now and the policies in place, we're about 2.6, 2.7 degrees. There's, again, lots of distribution around that. That's a degree Celsius of a bend in the curve over 10 years as a result of the Paris Agreement and everything it has led to. That's really important progress, and yet that's nowhere near where we need to be. If you look already at the extreme weather events that we're seeing, look at the double whammy of Hurricane Milton and Helene. I know a lot of people who thought Asheville, North Carolina was going to be their climate haven, and now they see that it's really been devastated by the flooding. So we're seeing those impacts happen everywhere, and that's why, and we're seeing those happen at one point, we've actually been at 1.5 degrees for the past 12 months. That'll come down. There are some temporary things happening. We're certainly at 1.2 plus, on a long-term trend. So even where we are now, we're seeing those impacts. We know that emissions and the temperatures are rising. So we know we have to do something about it. And I think that's why we're having the conversation. I know we'll talk more about this. I just want to say, we'll hear this again and again, it really is important, even as we have this conversation, we don't take our eye off of the importance of mitigation and adaptation. I think that's sort of a given here, but it's always worth saying. And I know we'll come back to that tension later on.
I want to dive into this idea of research. And David, I'll be coming to you for this question. You know, you and other experts, and we've heard that from Hina as well, emphasize really the big difference between researching this technology and deploying it. I recently had the pleasure of asking former Secretary of State John Kerry what he thought about geoengineering, and his first very strong reaction was extremely negative toward the technology. But at the very end, he said, but I'm not opposed to researching it, which helps give credence to why David is here at Chicago doing this research. So David, what are you hoping, or what are you planning to have your research help determine about these set of technologies, to help allay concerns from people like Kerry?
Yeah, let me first kind of actually jump in on the political Kerry point. So it's great that he said that, but just as a sort of level setting, it's important to know that the US government basically has no research program on this. Formally, the White House laid out the details of the research program, but then were very careful to say they weren't funding it. So it is quite amazing in a sense that this thing that there's actually thousands of papers on, and it's been reviewed by IPCC and many other 2 National Academy panels recently and a National Academy panel back in 1990, and there's really evidence that it could be quite profoundly useful in reducing climate risks, including climate risks for some of the world's most vulnerable, that the concerns about this kind of moral hazard effect are so strong that the decision by, say, the US is pretty much to say, hear no evil, see no evil, we won't have a research program, which is, I think, will change, but it's striking that that's still the position, despite Kerry's comment. So what will research look like? I think it's important to say that this is not like a new technology somebody's cooking up in a laboratory where the next step is to test it and have a proof of concept. A gentleman last night at dinner was asking me about how would we do a proof of concept test. I think there's a deep sense in which we don't need to. This is really building on atmospheric science that's been around for half a century, or in some cases closer to a century. So there's really, it sounds overconfident when I say it, but there's really no question at the level of basic climate science that if you have a little bit of aerosol that will reflect some sunlight and make the Earth a little bit cooler. This is not an obscure piece of climate science. It's really right at the mainstream. There have been more than half a century of detailed science on the way aerosols reflect sunlight and their impacts on the climate. So the issue is not, is it sort of fundamentally doable? The issues are all about the confidence with which we could predict what the effects would be and what the harms would be. And that's really the central thing. So it's not so much about a test, but it's about ways to reduce the uncertainty of our science and to have more confident assessments about that science so individual members of the public and public policymakers could make decisions. So maybe I would say the most basic thing. If these technologies were used, it is certain that there would be some harmful side effects and some unexpected side effects. That's just true of any large-scale intervention. The issue is how big those are and how they stand compared to the benefits. My read is there's actually quite strong evidence that the benefits would be very large compared to the harms, but I might be wrong. And the central thing that we need is the ability for science to more accurately say what those benefits and harms would be, and that's really what the objective of research is.
And let's not forget that society is actually currently undergoing a massive experiment of our planet with climate change itself. It's just less coordinated than what we're trying to do here, and I think that it's an important status quo because either way, there are risks and trade-offs. Hina and Nat, would love to turn to you. And what type of answers do you want to get from the research? In other words, pitch David on things for this new institute to research. And coming from your unique perspectives, Nat representing environmentalists who have deep concerns about the moral hazard concern, which we will get to in just a moment, and then Hina, from you, like in terms of representing, a lower income country who has to grapple with the impacts of extreme weather today, what kind of answers do you want to see from the research?
Okay, to be honest, I'm less concerned about the answers I'm going to get from the research. I think the research needs to happen, and this is what the Commission clearly articulates. I'm more concerned about SRM or any other technology which is in some ways not one which is currently being used to fall in the trap of climate diplomacy and the divide between North and South. And that is a really big trap. Having experienced firsthand that something as simple as loss and damage fund, which is a fund which is required for the immediate needs of a country or a people or a region which has been hit by a catastrophe, which is climate-led, took us 20 years and God knows how many COPs to get through. And it literally, I think, took floods of 2022 in Pakistan, 33 million people affected, for it to be politically get the mandate to be pushed. This is how bad we are. So I would be very, very concerned that SRM would fall into the north-south trap of having taken positions which are not based on where ideas and facts would lead you, or logic, as I say, logic and rational thinking would lead you, but where positions would lead you, right? So very, very, very concerned about that. In terms of the research, clearly what we need to know, look, I think most scientists feel that it is kind of a simple answer that it will cool down the planet. But what will be the cost of that? Whether the diversity of the ocean, what will be the cost and what will be the long-term ramifications which may be unknown to us today? Can we go around that? And the second really big question, I think equally important as the research, is the governance structures around it, right? Because geoengineering is not going to really respect borders. So Amritsar and Lahore, where you do it in Lahore, it goes to Amritsar, etc. So it's things like this that you really need to think through, and that's why really, even though I'm not answering your question directly, but I would at this point say that please let this not become a North ask and the South, let it be something which is seen to be done by scientists which are hailing from all over the world, which is, it is collaborative effort, and let us not fall into the trap of countries taking positions which are not led by logical, rational thinking, but just by positions that they've taken historically.
That's such an important point, and so much of our current debate on so many topics, including climate, really seems to fall into this North versus South debate, and unfortunately with countries in the global South not getting their fair share and facing a lot of climate hypocrisy. That's a whole nother panel in and of itself. Nat, I want to come to you on the research topic. How is researching geoengineering being received by those in the environmental community? Not to ask you to speak for others in the group, but considering you talk to this community very closely.
Sure, so I'll just make 3 points here. One is on the sort of climate hawk, what I see as the climate hawk view for research, which probably supports David. The second is what I see in the community, and I don't speak for the range of environmental NGOs. And then the third point, I want to echo something that Hina said, which I think is really important about how the research is done. So in the climate hawk case, I mean, the key point here, and I think David has referred to it, but a lot of folks who have focused on the concerns around solar radiation management focus understandably on the risks of doing that. And as David said, there are real risks, but there's also risk from not doing it. And that risk trade-off is something we just need to understand much better. Kate said, there's a break glass moment. I often use the analogy like we may need to break the glass in case of emergency, but we need to know what's behind the glass. We need to know whether, is that a fire extinguisher? Is that something else? Does it even work? So we have to be doing the research to understand what it is that we're talking about and whether it would be useful, whether it would have the benefits, what the risks would be, how we would manage those. We know that if a volcano erupts, it cools the earth, but I think hopefully we can do better than that. And so that's really important. So I think that's the climate hawk view for research. And I think more and more groups in what you might think of as the sort of center of the NGO community are coming around to that. My old organization, Environmental Defense Fund, really happy to see them go out on a little bit more of a limb. I mean, C2S has been there for a while, but we're small and kind of non-aligned. And so it was nice to see EDF kind of step out on the research side as well. And I think that's really important. We're breaking a taboo that has been there before. At the same time, we need to understand there are lots of civil society organizations. I think almost 2,000 civil society organizations have signed a solar geoengineering non-use agreement. And that just tells you the depth and the breadth of the concern. And we need to deal with that. Because this is only going to succeed, and the research will only succeed if we can build that breadth of stakeholder support, or at least understanding. And that just takes me briefly to the third point, which reflects on something Hina said. The way we do the research is really important. I think it's terrific that the University of Chicago is leading on this, but if this only happens in places in the US and North America, it's just going to fail tomorrow, right? We have to be building the capacity of the research throughout the world, including in the global south, including in the countries that are going to be most vulnerable to this. Because when we get to the questions about governance, we need to have an equitable conversation where many voices feel that they're not just able to be heard, but they're informed. So we need to be thinking now about how that research is done and how the research is supported in places around the country, around the world, not just in the U.S. and Europe.
Now, you mentioned the 2,000 organizations that have signed a letter, a non-use for solar geoengineering, and we don't need to go through all of their concerns. I think some of that would be addressed in the research and the unknown unknowns. But one very overarching one is this moral hazard concern. So quick raise of hands, who here has heard that term and thinks they know what that means? Okay, so I'd say 2/3. For the few of us who think they know, but you're actually wrong, or for the folks who don't know, David, you actually might have been the first person to coin that term a couple decades ago. So why don't you give us just a brief definition of what that term is and why it's central to the debates on this topic?
So I probably miscoined it. I think I certainly didn't coin moral hazard. I used it for geoengineering, and I think it was in many ways the wrong construction. So the classic version of moral hazard is this idea where people don't see the full cost of their insurance. So if flood insurance is always covered by the government, then people rebuild in floodplains, and there's some moral hazard associated with that. It's not actually clear that moral hazard is quite the right term here. I think there's really two kinds of concerns. One is exploitation by people who have a strong interest in avoiding emissions cuts, by fossil fuel companies or fossil-rich nations that may overclaim about how well solar geoengineering might work in order to argue for slower emissions cuts. I think that's likely to happen. It's just the way self-interest works. And the second one is a kind of so that's one group against another issue. The second one is a sort of a temptation to take the easy short-term way out. The fact is, this is all about timescale. If the goal was only to reduce temperature change over the next, say, 5 years, then it's actually pretty clear-cut that solar geoengineering would be the most effective way to do it. Because reducing emissions only very slowly adds benefit that adds over time. So if you think very short-term, solar geoengineering always looks right. But if you think very short-term, we're screwed. And you have to think long-term. The whole essence of the climate problem is we have to deal with the accumulation of carbon dioxide. And so there's this inevitable tension between short and long-term that is really at the core of the problem. And I guess I want to add one other, maybe some context that might surprise you. So for some of you, this topic may be new, and it's certainly new in the kind of broad public dialogue, but the topic is actually not new at all. The topic was there at the beginning of all the kind of modern debate about climate. In the first report to a US president in 1963 or 4, to President Johnson, in the National Academy reports of 77 and 80, the topic was there, and then the kind of moral hazard concern pushed it out of the climate mainstream. And the central concern is still governance. And so I have a quote I refound recently from an article Steve Schneider, a famous climate scientist who was a bit of a mentor to me, wrote in 1974 about climate engineering. We have the impression that more schemes will be proposed for climate control or climate engineering than for control of the climate controllers. It's easier to think of schemes for how we're going to, technical people like me can think of schemes much more easily than we can think of schemes for restraining and governing these technologies. And I think the central challenge that Steve said very well in this article in 50 years ago is how we govern these technologies in a divided world.
That's well put, David. And want to bring in Hina on this question about, for lack of a better term, the moral hazard concern, the risk that if we were to deploy or research or deploy either one is going to give a pass to people who want to keep emitting greenhouse gases.
I think that's a really big concern. And I think that's why at the Commission, this was something which was always there. And therefore, when we gave a proposal, we talked about what we call CARE, that first of all, C for cutting emissions should remain the main goal. And there's no way around it, and you don't let emitters use SRM as a technology to, use it as a boat to continue to emit, right? And that with it, adaptation is the requirement for today. All of this, whether it's cutting emissions, transferring to green technology, or adaptation requires climate financing. Now, coming from the developing world, it seems in the climate change area, the developed world will do what it will, and the developing world will suffer what it must, right? That's
Say that one more time for the audience, because I think it's really powerful.
So the developed world has been doing what it has, and the developing world will suffer what it must. Okay, as an emitter, as a less than 1% emitter, a country like Pakistan has been on the receiving end of climate carnage. Now our people ask us, we are not the ones who've done it. Shall we take money from feeding our children and putting children to school, which happen to still be concerns in a country like Pakistan, and transferring to green technology? And you have a certain limited pool of resources. You have the debt burden, and all of that in the developing world, when you're told, oh, you need to cut emission, and this is how costly it's going to be. Now in Pakistan, interestingly, unlike the United States of America, we don't have the luxury to be climate deniers. Guess why? Because we are on the receiving end of the wrath of climate change in many, many different ways. So weather patterns, I was just discussing with you. I brought a coat to Chicago. I Googled. I should be wearing a coat right now. Now the cost for me for the change in weather pattern is my coat is lying unworn. But if you're a farmer in Pakistan, and during the wheat weather, the heat is not what it's supposed to be, the cost is far more than just having to keep a weather coat, a coat which is lying. So things are very real. We cannot afford to be climate deniers because we have to experience the cost of climate change every day. We have not been the contributors to this. So when we're asked to pay the entire cost repeatedly, people are. So I think it really depends on what your worldview is. Do you want to live in a world where, as I said, the developed will do what they will and the developing should suffer? Or do you want to maybe go to what the Climate Change Commission recommends, the idea of differentiated responsibility? Okay, those who have emitted more should perhaps do more carbon dioxide removal, should perhaps do more, spending on development financing so that, and we are so bad I'm sorry, I'm being a little bit pessimistic. I have no reason to be optimistic on this thing because I was in government at that time and there was carnage, there were 33 billion people, and I went back to the Foreign Office and said, let's sit there and find out. There has to be some financing available for immediate funding of these people. And guess what? There wasn't. There isn't. There really isn't. $100 billion for climate financing is what is pledged. The requirements are 20 times more, and what actually comes from the pledges is perhaps 100 times less. It's it doesn't look pretty out there, right? So let's not try and say, oh, we did pretty well. Where I come from, we didn't do very well, collectively, as human race. So this is the humanity problem. It's not a David problem, Henna problem, or your problem. It's everyone's problem, okay? And it does not respect borders. And I think we still don't get it. We think that we will go to our high-rise buildings and protect ourselves. And the poor must suffer what they will. It will not respect any borders or any GDP per capita. You can't wear your GDP per capita and say, oh, climate, please don't come, spare me. It doesn't happen like that.
Such powerful words, yes.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Nat, I want to turn to you about this risk of if we do geoengineering, it will soften the pressure on other things. What I heard from you, Hina, is that it needs to be both. Or potentially geoengineering, but definitely still mitigation of emissions.
Yeah. So
Nat, does this concern you, though, that it could actually change the debate and give the fossil fuel companies?
Well, so let me start by saying, absolutely, and as I said in the beginning, it always bears emphasis. We have to be doing much more mitigation. We have to be doing much more. We have to be putting finance into adaptation, and those have to take precedence. And I don't think anyone's debating that, but it's just worth saying that again and again, right? Because I think that's really important to hear. The second quick point, though, is actually, I just talked about the importance of adaptation, and everyone agrees and nods along. But 15 years ago, 20 years ago, I've been working in this area long enough, there was a whole moral hazard debate about adaptation. Oh, if we talk about adaptation, is that going to take away the pressure to act on mitigation? And we figured out how to make sure that didn't happen. And we have to be talking about adaptation because of the impacts we're seeing. I'm not saying it's as easy with solar geo or with SRM, but I just make the point that just saying, well, boy, there might be a moral hazard, doesn't end the conversation. And then here's the third point, and this maybe is where I'm I have a little bit of maybe an unusual view. And my view is, that the actually talking about it alleviates the moral hazard. And here's what I mean. The naive view, let's say the Freakonomics view, for those of you who read that book. I'm an economist, so I can knock on Steve Levitt. So the naive Freakonomics view is, oh my gosh, we have this technology. It's aerosols. We can put it it's just like a volcano. It's just like Pinatubo. It's so cheap, we can put it in the atmosphere. Doesn't that sound great? Cost benefit must be amazing. End of story. If everyone believed that naive view, there is a moral hazard. Because then you say, oh my gosh, that seems like, why are we spending all this money on cutting emissions when we have this great technology? But as soon as you understand, A, that it's a temporary solution, it could be a long-term, it could be a temporary solution over many years, but it doesn't address the cause, it only addresses the symptoms. And B, that there's significant, real potential risk from using it, and that we don't understand those risks, I think that starts to alleviate the moral hazard. I think, frankly, people start to say, wait a minute, you mean if we don't get our act together and cut emissions, we might be doing something that's like a massive planetary experiment that could have devastating consequences for oceans and life on Earth? That doesn't sound so smart. Maybe we ought to go back to plan A. I think that giving more information on this can actually not only improve on the research side, as we've been saying, but alleviate some of that moral hazard.
Definitely, and I just want to call out in our final moments that we didn't quite get to carbon removal, which is another part of this debate. And I think that's reflective of where our conversation is going. Carbon removal is getting more firmly put into the mitigation category, where it probably fits a little bit better given the way it is structured as a technology. And so we'll have to save the conversations about that for the reception. In our final moments, I want to do one more rapid fire lightning round. You guys were in the audience for the last one, but the questions are different. Got to keep folks on your toes. Would you rather live in Chicago in the summer or winter? No, nobody jump first.
Winter. I actually faced that choice because my other home is Alberta and I like the cold.
Oh.
I take the winter. I love the snow.
Yeah.
Never get enough of it.
I don't know well enough, but I'm going to take the summer from what I've read.
Yeah.
Would you rather speak every language in the world or communicate with animals?
Absolutely communicate with animals.
Animals for sure. Yeah.
I'll take every language in the world. I'm just.
And would you rather change the past or see the future?
See the future.
See the future.
See, I saw that one coming. I want to change the future. So that's.
And that's why the Institute's here. I want to thank our panelists for this conversation.
Super. Thank you.